What we have for us today is a question. I wanted to pose this question to all of my dear viewers about: is something that is popular always good? Or is something that is not popular bad? We're talking about this from both a Mythic Plus as well as a raiding perspective. It doesn't have to be particularly for either one of the two activities, but you can get to see some situations which might surprise some of you or might confuse some of you, especially if you're playing one of the specs in these situations. Like, for example, you are playing a very popular spec, but you see yourself being outdone, being out-damaged, for example, by some more underplayed specs, or vice versa. Maybe you're playing a niche spec and you keep doing well and you wonder, why is this spec so underplayed? I am doing great on it, it seems strong, yet nobody seems to play it. This is a question, of course, that comes up every season, every expansion, every meta, where the meta is formed, and by definition, you're gonna end up having 6, 7, or 8 specs that are considered very strong, that are invited in Mythic Plus, and then you end up having 5, 10, if the situation is terrible, even 15 specs, all at the bottom, all unwanted, for example, maybe in the raid, maybe in Mythic Plus. What we have here, for example, just to show you the idea of this question, is related to the popularity of each spec in Mythic raiding, comparing the power, the results, the logs of the specs compared to their popularity. So very simple: if you are very high on the y-axis, if you're very high vertically, it means you're played a lot. And if you're very deep to the right, on the x-axis, it means you're doing a lot of damage. Generally, for balance, you want to see specs around this line, in this quadrant, meaning you are both popular and also doing well. Then the outliers are going to be either towards the bottom or towards the top. For example, a very good case that might make people confused is Beast Mastery. In terms of score, in terms of performance, is around 81, and Marksmanship is around 81. Yet, in the number of parses, Beast Mastery is approximately 100 times more played than Marksmanship. Why? If they are close in score, why is one so much more played than the other? You could have also other examples like Assassination being far higher in popularity compared to Subtlety, even though their performance is similar, maybe even Enhancement and Elemental, and similar other cases. Or you might have other questions like, why is Retribution Paladin so high in number of parses, in number of players who are actually playing the spec, when they are doing so terribly? They are towards the very bottom in terms of score, in terms of performance, yet they are this far up. You could be asking the same question when it comes to Mythic Plus rather than Mythic Raiding. You know, look at the top tier specs. Oh yeah, I know about Assassination Rogue, I know about Havoc Demon Hunter, I even know about Demo Warlock. However, Fire Mage is new. And should we actually consider Fire Mage, considering the amount of parses who put Fire Mage at this damage is 2? How about Arcane Mage with 6 parses? You know, way less than the ones of Beast Mastery, the ones of Havoc Demon Hunter, for example. So how much is this worth when it comes to being powerful? You can look at even a different type of result in here, where again, Havoc Demon Hunter has tons of popularity with tons of damage. Meanwhile, comparatively, Red Paladin has a very similar damage to survival, but Red Paladin is 5 times more popular than a survival hunter. Why? If their damage is so close, why is one spec so much more played than the other? These are some of the questions that might make people a bit confused and not really sure how to gauge how powerful or how meta a certain spec is. Now, for many of these questions, the answers related to the raid are more simple to give than the answers related to Mythic Plus. That's because the answers to the raid are due to many times checking the overall damage meters. And the overall damage meters are easier to manipulate. You have an easier time trying to send the message you want to send just by looking at the overall damage meter, like for example Marksmanship Hunter being a top 8 spec in the raid right now, even though once you look at the parses, Marksmanship has 800 parses compared to the 38,000 of Beast Mastery. So how can it possibly be so powerful if it's not even as played as Survival? How does that make any sense? The reason for this, for players who, for example, don't know, are not aware, and are maybe even wondering whether or not Marksmanship is super good, is because the overall damage performance from all bosses gets skewed by looking at particular bosses. For example, at the end of the day, if you look at Volkoros, which is a pure single target boss, Marksmanship is the 4th worst of all of the specs. But then you go and look at a boss like Larodar, and suddenly Marksmanship is the top DPS spec in the game with massive outliers in terms of max DPS. How is that? It is that because Marksmanship has still, while not being a very good spec, very powerful small target, 3 to 4 target cleave damage. And guess what happens on Larodar? A bunch of 3s, 3 of them, spawn every once in a while. They line up, especially if Marksmanship is given Blessing of Autumn from a Paladin. They line up with their cooldown, they blast them down with tons of burst damage on 3 to 4 targets, and the result is very heavy overperformance on this particular boss. So for the raid, it's easier to show up with these type of top performances by showing up on particular bosses compared to others. The same can be said for example, Elemental, who is also at a similar level of performance of Marksmanship. Back in the case of Elemental, this will be Council. Here is Elemental being massively ahead of everyone else together with Balanced Druid, because Council is a 3 target cleave, spread cleave fight where Elemental can do very well. Even though, in a similar case to Marksmanship Hunter, if you move to a pure single target boss like Volkoros, Elemental is in the bottom half. Even if you move to something like Igira, Elemental is just in the average middle. Back to Nimue, Elemental is again towards the bottom half, and then you go back to the overall damage meters and Elemental is suddenly in the top half, even though basically every other boss other than Council, Elemental wasn't doing nearly as well. So for the raid, it's easier to manipulate these results just by being very good at a particular boss, or maybe a couple of bosses. Even if you suck, even if you are below average in the remaining 6 or 7 bosses, as long as you can have a niche result on a couple of bosses, you can show up and overperform. So to many players who don't follow these results, to many players who don't watch and keep track of these individual results, all they do is look at the average results and they're like, wow, Elemental is a top half, top 8 or top 10 spec. Marksmanship is even better, right? That's the type of reaction they will get, even though it's not particularly true. Instead of looking at things like these, which just give you the actual result. No commentary, no extra details, just looking at the pure results. That is the base answer you get. But if you move to, for example, a tier list, which takes into consideration also the number of logs they are doing in the other bosses, as well as the results in the other bosses being weighted more than just topping a particular boss fight, Elemental will be going down to being into the C tier, into the bottom tier, together with Marksmanship. So the shenanigans of being good in a couple of boss fights won't be enough to trick a tier list, for example. What about Mythic Plus though? Because Mythic Plus doesn't have something as simple and as easy as being able to check the performance of each spec boss by boss, right? Mythic Plus is, even if you go over here and look at the stats of Mythic Plus, all you get to see is just a very confusing list of all of the specs together, tanks, healers, based on the amount of keys they are seen in. It doesn't really tell you much. Even if you go into an actual tier list and you check the Mythic Plus tier list, doesn't actually tell you much other than the amount of damage they are doing on average per key, right? So it's harder to get an idea of how specs are doing. As we mentioned, you can have situations where certain specs show up at being quite low, maybe even matching the damage of specs being above them. like we made the example of Red Paladin, for example, and something like Fury Warrior or something like Fire Mage. Just by looking at the sheer amount of damage they do, you can be tricked, like for example, into believing that Windwalker Monk is suddenly a top Mythic plus spec, compared to in a tier list where Windwalker Monk is rightfully put towards the bottom. So in a sense, it's actually easier to not be tricked when looking at the Mythic Plus results compared to the Raid. Because in the Raid, you can be swayed by things like these, you can be swayed by rankings like these, which might make you believe certain specs are performing way better than they actually are because they show up high in the results. When a tier list, regardless of which tier list you're looking at, might show up the actual results much better. Like even changing from u.gg to sub-creation, even sub-creation is not falling for marksmanship being a top 8 rage spec. They're still gonna be put at the very bottom of the results. Same goes for a few decent results of destruction or affliction showing up, you know, somewhat in the middle in a couple of bosses, still not being enough to not be at the very bottom of a tier list. For Mythic Plus, as mentioned, there is less to be baited by, because you don't have things like these about Mythic Plus, you don't have rankings like these about Mythic Plus, so you can only gauge who is strong by looking at a tier list, or more simply by being in game, being in the looking for group tool and finding out and noticing yourself who gets constantly invited, and also looking at yourself at the performance of the specs in your groups. You know, I doubt it would have taken you more than 10 groups of Mythic Plus with a Demon Hunter in the same group with a Frost DK to realize the Demon Hunter was just blasting the Frost DK away in terms of damage, right? That is a more close contact way of realizing how a spec performs compared to the Raid. So back to the question of, is popular always good? And at the same time, if something isn't popular, does it mean it's bad? If something is popular, doesn't mean it's always good. We have seen in these examples some of these being true. Like for example, sure, this can be misleading because it's very underplayed, so the results are volatile, they are not very reliable. Same goes for Elemental. Same goes even for Subtlety and to a degree for Destro. But what about the opposite? What about the super popular specs like Red? A spec with this many parses, meaning you have a lot of data for them to show up on multiple bosses, and still doing badly, is still a pretty good amount of certainty that the spec is just not doing too well, right? For marksmanship, you can be, you know, there were 15 logs on the boss. I'm not sure how reliable those are, but for Red, the amount of logs are more than enough to gauge the fact that they are doing poorly, for example. And also the confirmation that the question, is being popular also being good, is not really true. In the case of Red, it's just a community decision. Players just like to play Red. Or in general, players just like to play Paladin and also Red. So it just ends up being a popular spec, not necessarily a powerful one. This was the same a season ago where Havoc was very popular. But Havoc last season wasn't strong, Havoc last season wasn't meta, it wasn't part of the more invited picks in Mythic Plus or one of the stronger picks in the Raid either, yet it remained popular. But being popular did not mean it was good. It's only good as far as you are concerned when it comes to getting invited into groups. If you're popular, you might have more chances just because there is way more of a presence of your spec in the meta, even though you're not doing too well. So in terms of being popular, no. It doesn't mean that if you're popular, you are always good or meta. The other question is a bit more tricky to answer, which is, if you are not popular, does it mean you are terrible? Back to our results here, there are specs that are not popular, and the majority of these are, yes, they're not good. So you're not popular equals you're not good. And then you have some outliers. What about Outlaw not being popular, or Subtlety, or Elemental, or Marksmanship, or Survival? Do these also count even though their performance is good? So far, we have debunked a couple of these, like Elemental and Marksmanship primarily being good in just a couple of bosses, spiking up their total results across all bosses, which is not the same thing. these are also debunkable by simply the fact that they are not low in popularity because they are bad. That's the other big caveat in the question, if you're not popular, are you bad? Sometimes you just happen to be in a first world problem type of issue where rogues are right now. Right now, rogues are 3 specs, all 3 showing up technically as the best performers in the raid, 1, 2, 3. However, you cannot split yourself into 3 if you're playing a rogue. You're not a Windwalker monk, so you can't do that. You can only choose 1. Therefore, when the rogue players collectively choose the spec that is the strongest for the given content, in this case, let's say assassination, what is the result is that the other 2 specs start losing a lot more players. So they end up in a situation like this one, where their performance is still top tier, just slightly below assassination, and their popularity is matching the popularity of a Windwalker. Are they as powerful as a Windwalker because they are as underplayed? Obviously not. Windwalker is the only DPS of Monk, it's the only option if you want to play Monk, so you have no other ways out of the class. For rogues, it's different. For rogues, you simply happen to be in the bad situation of being overshadowed by a spec in your own class that is simply stronger. This is the same case we have seen before, and you can see multiple times in things like Warlock or Mage, when one of their specs was super meta and the others were not even that bad, but they were simply losing a lot of players because of how popular, for example, Demo Warlock was last season, or Fire Mage was a lot of times when it came to Mage. So while the question, if you are popular, are you always good, is a definite no, because very often certain specs are chosen for some reason by the player base to be very played. Balanced Druid is very played, regardless if it's powerful or not. Rat Paladin, you also have Holy Priest, even Blood Decay. These happen to be specs that can be played very often without having to be many times super powerful. While the other question is a bit trickier. If you are not popular, if you're underplayed, does it mean you are weak? In many cases, the answer is yes, of course. That's what players do when they form a meta. They simply leave the worst at the bottom of the play rate, so that's true. But there are going to be some situations, like for example, certain specs being only strong in a couple of instances, in a couple of situations, like we made the example of Elemental and Marksmanship in the raid, or other specs that are being overshadowed by their counterparts in the same class. Whether it is Marksmanship being overshadowed by BM, Arcane and Frost overshadowed by Fire, Destro and Affliction overshadowed by Demo, maybe even something nowadays happening like Devastation overshadowed by Augmentation. That's the other case where the question of is being underplayed always meaning being weak, where the answer to that question is no. Sometimes it's one of these 2 things. You're not necessarily always weak if you are underplayed. You just need to know basically where to look at, realizing why is a thing being underplayed. Sometimes it's because you're terrible, not because another spec in your class is taking away all your players, like Windwalker or like Shadow Priest, for example, while other times it is indeed because you have a more powerful option in your spec, for example. This was, for today, the completely needless clarification on this point, on why do certain specs get to be so popular even when they are not powerful, and vice versa, why do certain specs that are still strong, middle of the pack, maybe potentially even top half of results, but still end up not being played. What could be the reason for that? And the general questions that come from the community following these situations. If a spec is popular, must it mean it's good? And then if a spec is not popular, must it mean it's not good? So let me guys know, of course, what do you think about these 2 takes down in the comments. What have been your experiences in playing popular specs that were not OP, as well as underplayed specs that were still strong, especially when it came to the reaction and the dealing with the rest of the community, and how the rest of the player base was taking towards these type of specs in these unique situations. And besides this, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your cold, rainy day. At least that's how it is around here. Now, the goodbyes, of course, start by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can also follow up while being completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, this was longer than I thought. I wanted to make this some 13, 15 minutes long. We went overboard.